I'm Samantha Foster, and this is Venus Mastermind, a space for honest reflection, pattern breaking, and sovereign thinking. I'm not here to perform or to teach in a formal way. This is a shared reflection, a place to think out loud, to name what's been living in me, and to speak honestly about what I'm seeing and integrating. There's no agenda here beyond truth and presence. If something here resonates, take what's yours and leave the rest. So we've been building something together over the course of this series. We started with morals, the inherited judgments we carry, the ones that tell us what's right and wrong before we ever get a say. Then we moved into values, the internal priorities that shape where our energy actually goes, whether we've named them or not. In the bonus episode, we took everything from those first two conversations and pressure tested it against real life, actually sitting down with a moral constitution and seeing what holds up and what doesn't. And then in our most recent episode, we sat with ethics, the way we navigate responsibility when power enters the picture. Each of those layers has been about something we hold inside ourselves. Something personal, something that shaped how we make meaning, how we prioritize, and how we show up when it matters. Today we're going somewhere different because principles aren't really about us, not in the way morals and values are. Principles are about reality, about how things actually work, whether we like it or not, whether it feels fair or not, whether it matches what we were taught or not. And I think this is the layer that catches most of us off guard, because we can have beautifully clarified morals. We can know exactly what we value. We can show up ethically in every interaction and still get blindsided, still end up hurt or confused or wondering, how did I not see that coming? That's usually a principle we hadn't named yet, a pattern we hadn't recognized, a piece of how reality operates that we were hoping didn't apply to us. So that's what we're sitting with today. Not what we believe should be true, but what we observed to be consistently true, and what changes when we finally name it. Let's start by getting clear on what we're actually talking about, because this word gets used in a lot of different ways, and I want us working with the same foundation.
What principles actually are.
When most people hear the word principles, they think of personal codes, rules you live by. I'm a person of principle, and that's how it's usually used in conversation. But that's not what we're talking about here. In this framework, in the internal ecosystem, principles are something different. They're not rules you choose. They're observations. They're patterns you've noticed about how reality actually functions. Not shoulds, not aspirations, not moral positions. Just, this is how it works. Let me give you some examples. Power concentrates. That's not a moral statement. It's an observable pattern. You can see it in politics, in corporate structures, in families, in communities. Power tends to gather and protect itself. Systems protect themselves, not because they're evil, because that's what systems do. Self-preservation is built into the architecture of every institution we interact with. Truth does not guarantee safety. That one's hard, because most of us were raised to believe that if we're honest, things will work out. And sometimes they do. But truth, by itself, does not override power structures. That's a principle. It's not cynicism, it's observation. Trust compounds slowly and breaks quickly. We've all lived that one. Capacity determines options. The more resources you have, skills, savings, knowledge, health, and support, the more choices are actually available to you. Unexamined pain repeats. Incentives drive behavior more than ideals do. These aren't moral claims. They're structural truths about how human systems tend to operate. And here's the distinction that matters most. Morals guide how we behave. Principles guide how we interpret the world. Our ethics say, I don't deceive. Our principles say, others may deceive if incentives reward it. That difference right there is what protects us from disillusionment. And this is where it gets subtle. Because there's something that looks a lot like a principle but operates very differently. And confusing the two is where a lot of us get stuck.
What principles are not? Beliefs versus principles.
This distinction changed something for me when I finally saw it clearly. A belief is something we hold to be true. A principle is a pattern we've observed repeatedly, one that appears to govern how things actually behave. They can feel similar, but they operate very differently. Here's what I mean. Belief, hard work pays off. Principle, incentives determine what kind of effort gets rewarded. See the difference? The belief is broad and motivational. The principle is structural and testable. Another one. People are fundamentally good. Principle. People act according to incentives, capacity, and perceived threat. The belief is interpretive. It's a lens you're choosing. The principle is explanatory. It's a pattern you've extracted. And here's what separates them most clearly. Belief can exist without evidence. Principles require repeated observation. Beliefs can be inherited. Principles are usually extracted from lived experience. Beliefs can be comforting. Principles can be deeply uncomfortable. Beliefs shape how we interpret events. Principles shape how we anticipate outcomes. And here's the sharpest way I've heard it put. A belief is something we think is true. A principle is something we operate as if it is structurally true across contexts. Beliefs can wobble. Principles organize behavior. And here's what matters most. If we believe the system will take care of us, we relax into it. If our principle is that systems optimize for stakeholders' gain, we ask questions before trusting it. The trap, and it's a sneaky one, is when we mistake a belief for a principle. Because when we do that, bias sneaks in wearing the costume of wisdom. We think we're being strategic when we're actually being sentimental. And when we separate them, when we can actually tell the difference between what we hope is true and what we observe to be true, that's when clarity shows up. So if principles aren't chosen like morals or prioritized like values, where do they actually come from? This is worth slowing down for.
How principles are discovered.
Principles aren't something we sit down and decide on. We don't choose them the way we might choose a value. They're extracted, usually from experience, often from painful experience. And here's what makes this interesting. Principles aren't individualized in discovery, but they're not purely subjective. What I mean by that is, two people can work inside the same system and walk away with different principles. One person in a corporate environment might conclude hard work is rewarded. Another person in the same company, maybe even on the same team, might conclude visibility matters more than effort. Neither of them is making it up. They're each seeing a different slice of the same system. Principles are pattern recognition filtered through exposure. Now, some principles are what I'd call universalish. They show up across contexts, across cultures, across industries. Things like incentives shape behavior. Power tends to consolidate. Trade-offs are inevitable. Repeated behavior predicts future behavior. But there's a second category, personal principles. They describe how we operate in the world. Things like, I perform best under autonomy. I shut down in chaotic environments. I lose clarity when I'm sleep deprived. I thrive when I'm challenged rather than coddled. The first group describes the world. The second group describes us in the world. Both are principles, just different scope. And here's the caution I want to name, because it's real. Because principles feel true. Because they're rooted in experience. We can accidentally overgeneralize them. I was harmed by this system becomes all systems are harmful. That's not a principle. That's pattern inflation. And it narrows our thinking instead of clarifying it. Good principles survive testing across contexts. That's how we know they're sturdy. So now that we've defined what principles are, what they're not, and how they're discovered, let's put them next to other layers we've already explored, because this is where the ecosystem really starts to click.
Principles versus morals, values, and ethics.
I want to lay this out simply, because once we see how these layers relate, the whole series starts to make a different kind of sense. Morals regulate how we act. They're the inherited guardrails, the things we carry about what's right and wrong. Values direct our energy. They're what we actually prioritize when no one is watching. Ethics regulate our behavior when power enters the picture. They're how we navigate responsibility. And principles describe how reality behaves. They're the operating patterns of the world we're moving through. Now here's why that distinction matters so much. If we ignore principles, our ethics can feel naive. We show up honestly and get blindsided because we didn't account for how the system actually operates. If we ignore ethics, our principle awareness can become ruthless. We see how the world works and use it to manipulate instead of navigate. If we ignore values, we drift. We become responsive to everything and anchored to nothing. If we ignore morals, we fracture internally. We lose the thread of who we are underneath all the strategy. Principles inform strategy. Morals regulate behavior. Ethics operationalize responsibility. Values give direction. Different layers, all necessary, none sufficient alone. And when they're all working together, when we can see how they interact, that's when our internal ecosystem starts functioning like an actual ecosystem, not a collection of competing impulses, but a coherent system. And there's one area where this gets especially real, maybe confronting, and that's when we look at the system we participate in every day.
Principles and systems.
This is where principles stop being abstract and start being practical. Because one of the most important principles most of us have to learn the hard way is this. Systems optimize for their own survival and stakeholder gain, not for individual fairness. Corporations optimize for profit. Healthcare systems optimize for throughput and liability management. Governments optimize for stability and control. Insurance companies optimize for risk minimization. None of those systems are designed around our personal flourishing. They're designed around system-level metrics, and that doesn't automatically make them evil. It makes them goal-driven. But when we don't understand the principle, when we walk into those systems expecting them to care about us the way a person might, we set ourselves up for confusion, for resentment, for a sense of betrayal that doesn't actually match what happened. The system didn't betray us. It did exactly what it was designed to do. We just didn't see the design. And here's where the maturity lives. We don't join systems because they love us. We join them because the exchange ratio works. We participate because the trade-off, what we give versus what we gain, makes sense for where we are right now. That's a real shift. From trust-based participation, the system will take care of me, to incentive-based participation. I'm going to assess whether this exchange benefits me sufficiently. That's not cold, it's clear. But here's the guardrail I want to name, because it's important. We can't let system awareness turn into system contempt, because every system we'll ever build, our business, our families, our communities, will have incentives too. We'll have stakeholders, we'll have trade-offs. The question isn't, is the system pure? It's, are the incentives transparent? And does the exchange benefit me enough to participate? That's strategic adulthood, not innocence, not cynicism, literacy. Now, there's a confusion that comes up at this point, and it's worth pausing to untangle, because when we start talking about principles and systems in the same conversation, the two can start to blur together, and they're not the same thing. This is where it gets really precise. A principle is not a system. A principle is a rule of orientation. A system is a structure built from principles. Think about gravity for a second. Gravity is a principle. An airplane is a system built while respecting that principle. If you ignore gravity, your system fails dramatically and publicly. So when we're talking about principles, we're talking about the underlying truths we orient around, not moral truths handed down by culture, not opinions, structural observations about how reality works. And when we're talking about systems, the healthcare system, the corporate structure, the legal system, even a coaching business, those are structures built from principles. They're engineered responses to the patterns someone's observed or assumed. So when we're talking about principles, we're talking about the underlying truths we orient around, not moral truths handed down by culture, not opinions, structural observation about how reality works. And when we're talking about systems, the healthcare system, the corporate structure, the legal system, even a coaching business, those are structures built from principles. They're engineered responses to the patterns someone observed or assumed. Here's the clean way to hold it. Principles answer, what is true about how this works? Systems answer, how do we design something that works because of that truth? Principles are invisible architecture. Systems are visible architecture. We don't scale principles directly. We embody them. We scale systems. And here's what that means for us practically. A principle is like a constraint field. It doesn't tell us what to build. It tells us what won't work. Gravity doesn't tell engineers what to design. It tells them what will collapse. Principles narrow that possibility space. Systems live inside those constraints. And notice what happens when a principle is wrong or fuzzy. The system built on it becomes brittle. It works until reality stress tests it. That's why some things we built in our lives feel like cardboard castles. The structure was there, but the underlying principle was borrowed instead of discovered. The more honestly we've extracted our principles from lived observation, the sturdier everything we build on top of them becomes. And here's one more useful layer. A method is a repeatable sequence inside a system. A system is the container that houses methods, and a principle determines whether the system survives contact with reality. That hierarchy principle system method is why some people's lives feel like coherent ecosystems, and other people's feels like a collection of disconnected tactics. The difference isn't effort, it's architecture. And architecture starts with principles. So what happens when we don't see the principles at play? When we walk through life with beautifully clear morals and values, but haven't named the patterns underneath? That's what I want to sit with next.
What happens when principles are ignored?
When we don't understand the principles operating around us, we can feel betrayed by reality itself. Think about it. If we hold the belief, if I tell the truth, things will work out, that's a moral hope. And it's a beautiful one, but the principle underneath it is different. Truth does not override power structures. When that belief collides with that principle, when we do the right thing and it doesn't protect us, the result is shock. And shock, when it's repeated, is what creates trauma loops. Not because the world is out to get us, but because our map didn't match the terrain. And I noticed that when we don't have named principles, we tend to fall into one of three patterns. Some of us blame ourselves for systematic outcomes. We internalize it. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? When really, we entered a system without understanding its operating principles. Others blame the world for everything. We externalize all of it. Nothing is fair, nothing works, everything is corrupt. That feels like clarity, but it's actually collapse. And then some of us swing between the two, between naive optimism and cynical withdrawal, back and forth, depending on the day. Principles stabilize that. They allow us to say, this isn't personal, this is structural. And that alone, just that one shift, reduces emotional reactivity. Reduced reactivity increases clarity. Clarity increases agency, and agency is self-leadership. It's not about becoming unemotional. It's about having a framework that holds us when our emotions are running hot. I want to make this real for a moment, because most of us have lived through a version of what I'm about to describe. A moment where everything we believed about how things should work collided with how they actually work.
When belief meets reality.
I want to share something from my own life here, because this isn't abstract for me. This is one of the hardest lessons I've had to learn. There was a period where I was moving through a legal situation, a court system, and I walked in believing something that felt completely solid at the time. If I tell the truth will be believed. If I show up with integrity, the system will recognize that. If I'm honest and transparent, the outcome will reflect that. That wasn't a strategy. That was a belief I had carried my whole life, a moral hope dressed up as a principle. And here's what I discovered. Courtrooms don't run on truth. They run on procedure, narrative framing, attorney skill, and leverage. They are adversarial systems. Adversarial systems optimize for persuasion, not fairness. Truth gets filtered through evidence, rules, judicial discretion, and whoever has more resources to shape the story. I told the truth and it got used against me. I tried transparency and it became ammunition. The system didn't care about my integrity. It was structured to process information, whatever information I gave it, through its own architecture. And that broke something open in me, not my morals. My morals stayed. My commitment to honesty stayed. What broke was the belief underneath, the assumption that honesty by itself would be enough to navigate a system with entirely different operating principles. The principle I extracted from that experience is one I carry to this day. In adversarial systems, outcome is shaped by leverage, strategy, and narrative, not truth alone. That's not bitterness, that's structural literacy. What I came to see, and it took time, was that the story I'd been telling myself had the wrong frame. It wasn't I was punished for being honest. It became I entered a system without understanding its operating principles. That's not self-blame, that's empowerment. Because once we see the principle, we don't abandon our ethics, we adjust our strategy. Truth still matters, but truth alone isn't always enough. Truth plus documentation, truth plus preparation, truth plus understanding procedure, truth plus timing. Principles don't invalidate our ethics, they refine our ethics. They refine how our ethics are expressed within real systems. And that's the difference between naive goodness and mature integrity. And this leads to something that I think a lot of us resist hearing. But once we actually sit with it, it's one of the most freeing things in this entire conversation.
Principles are emotionally neutral.
Principles don't care how we feel about them. Gravity doesn't stop working because we're ethical. Power dynamics don't disappear because we're honest. Incentive structures don't rearrange themselves because we wish they would. And that can feel harsh at first, because most of us were raised with some version of, if you're a good person, good things will happen to you. And when they don't, it feels like a betrayal, like reality broke its promise. But reality didn't make that promise. We inherited a belief that told us it did. And here's where it becomes freeing instead of heavy. When we stop expecting a system to care about us, we stop being disappointed by it. We stop being shocked by outcomes that are entirely predictable once we understand the architecture. Think of it like gravity. We don't get mad at gravity. We don't feel betrayed when something falls. We build it differently because of it. We account for it. We work with it. Principles are the same. They're not punishing us. They're just operating. Remember what we said about principles being a constraint field? They don't tell us what to do. They tell us what won't work. Gravity doesn't punish us for jumping. It just means we need to account for it if we want to fly. The same is true for every principle we've named today. They're not obstacles. They're the terrain. And the better we understand the terrain, the more intelligently we can move through it. And when we understand them, we stop expecting fairness and start building leverage. Not to game the system, not to become manipulative, but to move through reality with our eyes open instead of closed. That's not cynicism, that's pattern recognition. And there's an enormous difference. So if principles are this layer of pattern recognition underneath everything, what changes when we actually name them? What does it look like when principles become conscious instead of running us from the background?
How defining principles creates self-leadership.
Here's what I've come to understand about this. If we don't define our principles, we still operate from them. We just do it unconsciously. They become hidden roles about how the world works. rules we never examined, never tested, never chose, and hidden rules run us. Someone who unconsciously operates from the belief that systems will protect them if they're ethical will be blindsided every time a system doesn't, not because they were wrong to be ethical, but because they didn't understand the operating principles of that environment. Self-authorship, actually writing our own life instead of reacting to someone else's script, requires three things working together: knowing what we value, knowing how we will act, and knowing how reality behaves. That third one is principles, and it's the one that most often goes unnamed. When we do name it, something practical shifts. If our principle is dependency reduces leverage, we'll naturally prioritize capacity building, not from fear, from structure. We'll build savings, build skills, build optionality, because the principle tells us that's where choice lives. If our principle is incentives drive behavior, we'll stop being shocked when people act in self-interest. We'll evaluate alignment instead of assuming goodwill is enough. And here's maybe the most powerful shift. Once we name a principle consciously, it becomes a tool. If we don't name it, it becomes a bias. That's the difference. When something goes wrong, instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" we can ask, "What principle is at play here?" That alone shifts shame into strategy, and that's self-leadership in action. And this is really the heart of what this whole episode has been building toward, because there's a maturity line here, and I think naming it is the most useful thing we can do.
Naive goodness versus mature integrity.
This is the distilled insight. Once we see the principles, we don't abandon ethics. We adjust strategy. That's the difference between naive goodness and mature integrity. And I want to lay it out concretely so we can feel the distinction. Principle: systems with power will often protect themselves. Moral: do not deceive for selfish gain. Ethic: tell the truth when aligned with integrity. Strategic adjustment informed by principle. Truth requires timing, documentation, and leverage. See the difference? The principle didn't weaken the ethics. They strengthened the execution. Principles prevent us from being idealistic in a predatory environment. They don't require us to become unethical. They just ask us to be awake. Ethics don't guarantee protection. Systems don't guarantee fairness. Values don't guarantee success. But understanding principles increases agency. And agency, real agency, grounded in clarity instead of hope, is the foundation of everything else we're building in this ecosystem. And there's one more thing we're sitting with before we start to close, because people sometimes worry that once you name a principle, you're locked into it forever. That's not how it works.
Do principles change?
Principles do change, because principles are based on observation, and our exposure changes over time. We enter new systems. We gain new experiences. We see patterns we couldn't see before. A principle that served us at 25 might need refining at 40, not because it was wrong, but because our vantage point shifted. We have more data now, more context, more nuance. Principles may shift when our values reorder, when our identity matures, when our context changes, when our level of responsibility increases. And here's the important distinction. Changing a principle consciously based on new evidence is integrity. Abandoning one unconsciously because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable is erosion. That's not instability, that's responsiveness. And responsiveness is not weakness, it's coherence. So before we move into our closing example, I want to leave some questions here, not to answer right now, just to carry.
The Principles Clarity Questions.
If you're sitting with this and wondering where to start, where to actually find your own principles, here are the questions I'd invite you to sit with, not to rush through, just to let them work on you. What keeps proving true in my life, whether I like it or not? What lesson have I had to relearn more than once? Where have I been naive before, and what did that teach me? What patterns do I now see quickly that I used to miss completely? What principles am I already operating from that I've never actually named? And maybe the most practical one of all, who benefits? What are the incentives? What is the trade-off? These aren't moral questions. They're pattern questions. And the answers, if we're honest with ourselves, are already there. They're just waiting to be named. I want to bring one more thing into the room before we close. Something lived, not theoretical, because everything we've talked about today is pointing toward this.
A lived example.
I want to show you what this looks like when it comes together, because the distinction between a principle and a system is one of those things that sound clean in theory but gets messy fast if you can't feel it in real life. So let me use something I know well, my own work. One of the principles I've come to hold, one I've observed across therapy, court, corporate environments, relationships, money, coaching, all of it, is this. Power either leaks or concentrates based on self-leadership. That's a principle. It's not a strategy. It's not a method. It's a pattern I've watched play out in every context I've moved through. When someone leads themselves well, when they have awareness, regulation, and the capacity to choose, their power concentrates. When they don't, it leaks every time, regardless of the domain. That's principle territory. It's a lens. It's an observation about how reality works. Now, everything I've built with Venus Mastermind, the courses, the podcast, the coaching, the containers, the ecosystem, those are systems. They're the visible architecture. They're designed to help someone apply that principle in their actual life. The principle answers what is true about how this works. The system answers how do we design something that works because of that truth. And here's another one that became clear to me. Everything I teach, everything I explore, everything I keep circling back to, it all leads to sovereignty. That's not a marketing decision. That's a principle level observation about integration. Sovereignty is the integrating state that resolves fragmentation. I didn't choose that because it sounded good. I observed it across every client, every pattern, every context. The courses are systems. The podcast is a system. The coaching structure is a system. They are vehicles. Sovereignty is the principle underneath all of them. And the reason that matters, the reason I'm sharing this here, is because most people build the other way around. They copy someone else's system, someone else's funnel, someone else's framework, someone else's structure, and then they wonder why it feels unstable, why it works for a while and then collapses under pressure. It's because the principles underneath were borrowed instead of discovered. The system was there, but the foundation was someone else's observation, not their own. When we derive our systems from our principles, from patterns we've actually observed and pressure tested across real life, the whole thing holds. Not because it's perfect, Because it's ours. Because the architecture matches the terrain we actually live in. And here's where the hierarchy becomes practical. A method is a repeatable sequence inside a system. A system is the container that houses methods. And a principle determines whether the system survives contact with reality. That hierarchy, principle, system, method is what makes the difference between a life that feels like a coherent ecosystem and one that feels like a collection of disconnected tactics. The difference isn't effort, it's architecture. And architecture starts with principles. So if something in your life keeps collapsing, a business model, a relationship pattern, a way of approaching your health, or your money, the question worth asking isn't just what system am I using? It's what principle is the system built on? And did I discover that principle from my own lived experience? Or did I borrow it from someone who was standing in a completely different storm? That question changes everything. So, as we close this one, I want to name where we've been and where we're heading, because the next layer builds directly on what we sat with today. We've been building something intentionally across these episodes, layer by layer. Morals tell us what we judge as right and wrong. Values tell us what actually matters to us. Ethics tell us how to navigate responsibility when power is present. And now, principles tell us how reality actually works, how systems behave, how patterns repeat, what's true whether we wish it were or not. And with all of that in place, the question becomes, so what do we actually allow into our lives? That's standards. Standards are where we take everything we've named, what we care about, how we choose to act, and how we understand reality, and we use it to filter, to decide what we participate in, what we accept, what we don't. Values tell us what matters. Principles tell us how reality works. Standards determine what we allow into our lives based on both. That's the next layer. And it's where this whole framework starts to become something we can use daily, in real decisions, in real time. And before we go, I want to name one more thing that I've noticed as we've been building this. Principles are fractal. The same principle shows up at multiple scales. Take sovereignty, for example. At the level of the nervous system, sovereignty is regulation plus choice. In relationships, it's boundaries plus agency. In leadership, it's responsibility plus alignment. In business, it's integrated architecture. Different systems, same principle echoing at every level. That's not branding, that's pattern recognition. And it's the reason everything we've been exploring in this series keeps converging instead of scattering. Principles are invisible, but they're the most practical thing we own. Systems can change. Principles evolve slowly, like tectonic plates, and everything else moves around them. I'm going to pause here and let this land. If something in this resonated, you don't need to do anything with it. Just sit with it and notice what continues to unfold. Thank you for listening and for being here with me.